You're tuned in to The Deep Dive, and today we're tackling a question that we hear a lot, especially for people looking at software testing. Do you actually have to write code?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the source we looked at gives a pretty detailed breakdown, which should help clarify things.
Great, because it seems like it's not just a simple yes or no answer, right?
Exactly. It really, really depends on the specific job you're doing within, software quality assurance.
Okay. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to cut through some of that confusion. We want to look at the different roles and figure out where coding fits in, or if it fits in at all for some of them.
Sort of a shortcut to understanding this piece of the puzzle.
Precisely. So let's jump right in. The source material kicks things off by setting up two main categories in software QA. What are they?
Right. So it identifies the quality analyst, usually just called QA, and the software design engineer and test, or SDET for short.
Feature UA and SDET. Got it. What's the sort of fundamental difference there?
Well, the main initial difference is really about when they get involved in the whole software development process and how technical each role tends to be.
Okay, so let's start with the QA role. What's their main focus?
The source says a QA primarily checks the software's functionality and completeness after the development part is done.
After. Okay.
So it's described as like less technical. And crucially, the source explicitly says this role may not require coding.
May not require coding. That's pretty clear for the QA role then. If you're thinking about finding bugs in the finished thing, coding might not be mandatory.
Exactly. That aligns well with the traditional QA idea.
Okay, so then what about the SDET? How's that different?
The SDET.
Yeah.
Well, they're described as needing to understand the inner workings of the software.
Inner workings. Okay, so more technical.
Definitely. We're talking database concepts, programming languages.
Mhm.
And what's really interesting is when they get involved, the source says they're part of the product design, data design, even UI discussions, much earlier.
Wow, okay, so they're really embedded in the development cycle, almost like a developer who specializes in testing.
That's a good way to put it, and that directly impacts the coding question.
Right. So what does the source say about SDETs and coding?
It's explicit. SDETs have to work during the development phase and require a coding knowledge. It's pretty much a must for them.
And does that include automation testers?
Yeah.
People using tools like Selenium?
Yes, absolutely. The source specifically mentions that automation testers using tools like QTP or Selenium can also be classified as SDET.
Okay, so automation equals SDET equals coding needed. That connection is clear.
hmm It really highlights how the need for coding depends heavily on which path you take in QA.
Makes sense. But the source also talks about skills for just being a good tester in general, doesn't it? Even if you're not an SDET.
It does. It lists three key things. Good domain knowledge, understanding the field the software is for.
Sure, like finance or healthcare.
Right. Then, good logical thinking, which is critical for problem solving. And the third one, good knowledge of programming skills.
Wait, okay, so good knowledge of programming skills for all good testers. Even the QA role we just said might not need coding.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. It seems a bit contradictory at first glance, doesn't it?
It does, and the source even points that out. It quotes someone saying, writing code and debugging is the developer's job.
And then asks the logical follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
Then the question arises, why coding knowledge is necessary for testers?
Exactly. So why is it listed as important even if you aren't actively coding day to day in a, say, pure QA role?
Okay, so to answer that, the source looks at different ways testing is done. It mentions manual versus automation testing, which most people know.
Right.
But it also brings in another classification, black box, white box, and gray box testing. This is about how much you know about the system's insides.
Okay, let's unpack those. Black box testing, first coding needed.
Source is super clear here. For black box, the tester does not require the knowledge of coding.
So you're just using it like a user would. Inputs, outputs, see if it works.
Exactly. You don't need to know how it works underneath.
Makes sense. Purely external view. Okay, so what about white box testing? Sounds like the opposite.
It pretty much is. The source calls it code-driven testing and flat out says it requires code knowledge.
Ah, okay. So you're looking at the code.
Yes. Understanding programming concepts, maybe languages like C, C#, C++A, and database concepts, RDBMS stuff. That's all mentioned as helpful or necessary.
Right, you're inspecting the engine, not just driving the car. That definitely needs technical skill. What about gray box? Does it mention that?
It doesn't go into as much detail on a gray box, but yeah, the implication is it's somewhere in between. You might know some internal structure, but maybe not down to the individual lines of code like white box.
Got it. So, circling back, why is general programming knowledge good for testers? Where does it really become necessary according to the source?
The source points specifically to automation testing and white box testing. Those are the areas where it says testers require good coding knowledge.
And why specifically for those? What makes coding essential there?
Well, for automation, it talks about needing to understand things like statement coverage, cyclomatic complexity.
Whoa, okay, technical terms there. What do those mean in plain English?
Basically, ways to measure how much of the code your tests are actually running through. Statement coverage is like, did we run this line of code? Code coverage is broader. Cyclomatic complexity. That measures how complicated the code's logic is.
I see. So you need programming knowledge to even understand those metrics, let alone write tests that effectively cover the code.
Precisely. It's not just about using a tool. It's about understanding the code you're testing and designing smart automation. You need programming logic, database understanding.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, does the source mention any specific coding or technical skills that are particularly useful for testers?
Yes, it does. SQL structured query language gets a specific shout out.
Ah, for databases. Exactly. Super important for database verification. Testers often need to check if data is being saved right, updated correctly. SQL is how you talk to the database.
Right.
It even lists examples like basic commands, select, create, update. Knowing those is really handy.
Definitely. Being able to check the data directly seems powerful. What else? Did it mention security?
It did. It brings up SQL injection.
Oh, yeah, that's a common hacking method, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And the source suggests that knowing JavaScript and SQL helps testers identify and, test for those kinds of vulnerabilities. Understanding how someone might inject bad code helps you prevent it.
So coding knowledge helps with security testing, too. It's not just about features working.
Absolutely. It broadens the tester's scope.
Right.
And then there's Agile testing.
Right. Agile methodologies are everywhere now. How does coding fit in there?
Well, Agile is all about collaboration, the whole team owning quality.
Yeah.
So the source says testers often work really closely with programmers, actually writing tests together.
Ah, okay. So they need to speak the same language, basically. Pretty much. The source says it's imperative for testers to know the code in Agile so they can create effective, automatable tests in that kind of integrated team.
So the lines blur a bit more in Agile, making coding skills even more valuable for testers working alongside developers.
Definitely seems that way.
Okay. The source also gives some practical tips for QA analysts, right? What kind of advice?
Yeah, it suggests that even if you're mainly doing manual testing, getting some knowledge of scripting languages like JavaScript will add credit to your testing skills. It makes you more versatile.
That's credit, so it's a bonus.
Kind of. And then it talks about basic knowledge of programming languages like Java or VBScript. It uses this interesting phrase, it is not must, but it is necessary.
Not must, but necessary. Okay, what do you think that means?
I interpret it as, maybe not strictly required for every single QA job description out there, but practically speaking, having that foundation is becoming increasingly important and beneficial for your career.
So highly recommended, even if not strictly mandatory everywhere yet?
Exactly. And it also doubles down on SQL and database concepts being a good practice for pretty much any tester.
Right. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. If we summarize the core message from our source, what's the main takeaway on coding for testers?
The source really circles back to those two main roles, the QA tester, where coding might not be required, and the SDET, where coding is required, especially for automation.
Okay.
And it reminds us about those three attributes of good testers. Domain knowledge, logical thinking, and yes, that good knowledge of programming skills.
Right.
But the most direct link is stated clearly. Testers require good coding knowledge when they go after an automation testing role. That seems to be the key differentiator.
So back to the big question. Do software testers have to code? The answer from this deep dive is, well, it depends.
It really, really does. Depends heavily on that specific role, QA versus SDET or automation engineer.
But it also sounds like even if you're aiming for a role that doesn't strictly require coding today.
Yeah, picking up even basic programming and database knowledge is probably a smart move.
How so? Well, it can open more doors, right? Help you communicate better with developers, maybe move into automation later if you want, make you a more well-rounded tester overall.
That makes sense. So for you, the listener, maybe think about it not just as a requirement, but as an enhancement. Investing a bit in understanding code could really pay off, regardless of your exact title.
Absolutely. It gives you a broader perspective.
Which leads to a final thought.
Right.
We're seeing more and more automation everywhere in tech, right?
Definitely.
So, thinking ahead, how might that trend keep changing software testing roles? What kinds of technical skills might become even more essential for testers down the line?
That's the big question, isn't it? As automation gets more sophisticated, will the line between tester and developer blur even further?
Something to think about as the field continues to evolve. It'll be interesting to see.